It is a Saturday morning, sometime in the 1890s. The century is not yet finished with itself, but already it has grown heavy with wealth. Along the shores of Rhode Island, on the green lawns of Long Island, in the marble corridors of Newport cottages that are nothing like cottages at all, the richest people in the world are waking slowly. There is no rush. There is never any rush here. The servants have been at work since before dawn. Fires have been lit, trays arranged, flowers cut and placed in tall crystal vases. The house breathes with quiet industry, and upstairs, behind velvet curtains drawn against the morning light, the men and women who built these palaces of American ambition are drifting toward wakefulness with the unhurried ease of people who have never once needed to hurry. Welcome. Settle in. Let the weight of your body sink a little deeper into where you rest tonight. This is the story of their weekends, the long gilded forgotten leisure of America's grandest age. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, subscribe. I post new stories every week. To understand how the very wealthy spent their Saturdays and Sundays in the Gilded Age, you must first understand where they spent them. Because the houses themselves, these extraordinary, almost mythological structures that rose along the Atlantic coast and in the hills above the Hudson River and beside the quiet lakes of upstate New York, were not merely homes. They were arguments. They were performances. They were the physical expression of an idea that had seized the imagination of American wealth in the last decades of the 19th century. The idea that money, if you had enough of it, could manufacture not just comfort but history itself. The term Gilded Age was first used by Mark Twain, who borrowed it from Shakespeare and bent it to his own satirical purpose. The age was gilded, not golden, covered on the surface with something that shone, while underneath, in the factories and tenements and rail yards that produced all this wealth, other kinds of lives were being lived. But we are not here tonight to examine the contradictions of that era. We're here to drift through its grandeur, to move quietly through its rooms, to feel the weight of its silence on a weekend morning when the great machine of American industry had stilled itself, at least for a few days, and allowed its masters to simply be. The houses. Let us begin with the houses. Newport, Rhode Island, was the great summer capital of Gilded Age leisure. By the 1880s and 1890s, it had become something so far removed from an ordinary seaside town that the word town barely applied. It was a theatre. It was a stage set built at enormous expense by the most powerful families in America, each one trying to outshine the others, each one commissioning architects and importing craftsmen, and ordering marble from Italy and timber from the Pacific Northwest and wrought iron from foundries in Pennsylvania, all for the purpose of creating a house that would speak for them when words could not. Richard Morris Hunt was the architect most associated with this era. He had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so, and he brought back with him a sensibility shaped by the great chateaux of the Loire Valley and the Renaissance palaces of Florence and Venice. When Alva Vanderbilt came to him in the early 1890s with instructions to build something that would surpass everything that had come before, Hunt did not hesitate. What he built between 1893 and 1895 was Marble House. To stand before Marble House today is to understand something about the nature of spectacle. The facade is white Tuckahoe marble, quarried in New York and cut into columns and pilasters and cornices that belong in feeling to ancient Rome. The entrance hall is lined with yellow sienna marble. The dining room, which Hunt modelled after the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, is encased in gilded bronze and cream-coloured marble. The gold room, as it came to be called, is literally golden. The ceiling painted, the walls panelled, the furniture upholstered in amber silk damask. The house cost $11 million to build. In the currency of today, that figure would run to somewhere between $300 and $400 million, and it was, by the standards of the time and the place, not even the most expensive house in Newport. That distinction belonged to the Breakers, the summer home of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, completed in 1895 and designed, also by Hunt, in the style of a northern Italian Renaissance palace. The Breakers sits on 13 acres at the edge of the Atlantic, its south facade looking directly out to sea. The house has 70 rooms. Its great hall rises 45 feet to a painted ceiling. The morning room is lined with alabaster. The billiard room is panelled in Spanish mahogany and decorated with Flemish tapestries. The kitchen is vast, equipped with a dual-fuel range so large that a man could stand inside it, and the wine cellar below holds enough bottles to supply a small city for a year. On a weekend morning in the summer season, which ran roughly from late June through early September, the Breakers was a busy place, even in its stillness. The staff numbered well over 30 for the summer months. Footmen in livery patrolled the corridors. Housemaids moved through the upstairs rooms with their dustcloths and their brooms. The head butler, a figure of almost military gravity, organised the morning with the precision of a military campaign. But all of this industry was largely invisible to the family and their guests. The servants used separate staircases, separate corridors, separate entrances. The great house was designed so that its mechanisms, the cooking and the cleaning and the laundering and the carrying, could proceed without ever disturbing the surface of leisure. From the perspective of those who lived there, things simply appeared. Trays materialized, fires were already burning, flowers were always fresh, the world arranged itself. Let your breath slow a little as you imagine this. A house so large that sound itself seems to lose its way inside it. Corridors that stretch longer than you expect. Rooms that open onto rooms. The smell of beeswax and fresh flowers. The distant sound of the sea. There were other houses, of course. Along Bellevue Avenue, the central artery of Newport's summer world, the great families had built their palaces in various styles and at various times. Ochre Court, built for Ogden Golet in 1892, was French Gothic, its great hall vaulted like a cathedral. Belcourt Castle, built for Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in 1894, was a French hunting lodge scaled up to the dimensions of a palace, its ground floor given over entirely to a stable for horses. Rosecliff, built for Theresa Fair Ulrichs in 1902, was modelled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles and contained famously the largest ballroom in Newport, a room that could hold 500 people and that had, on at least one memorable occasion, been flooded to create an indoor lagoon for a theatrical production. These houses were not simply residences, they were instruments. They were used to signal status in a society where status was everything. They were used to conduct the intricate social negotiations of the marriage market, where daughters of new money sought alliances with sons of old money, and where European titles, impoverished earls, bankrupt dukes, were acquired in exchange for American cash. They were used to host the elaborate entertainments that served as the primary social obligation of the very rich. The dinners for 50, the balls for 300, the garden parties and coaching parades and amateur theatricals and musicals that filled the Newport calendar from June to September. But on a quiet Saturday morning, before the social machinery had cranked itself into motion, they were simply places to exist in. Let yourself imagine that quiet now, the house at rest, the guests still sleeping, the family patriarch sitting alone in a leather chair in his study, a cup of coffee at his elbow, the morning papers on his knee. Outside, through the tall windows, the Atlantic glitters in the early summer light. A gardener moves slowly across the lawn, clipping something. The sound of the sea is a constant, unhurried breathing. The day has not yet begun. The house holds its breath. And somewhere below, in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread drifts upward through the house, very faint, very gentle, like a memory of something warm. The great houses of the Hudson Valley had a different character from those of Newport. Where Newport was theatrical and competitive and intensely social, the Hudson River estates were quieter, more private, more rooted in the idea of the American land itself. The Vanderbilts had their estate at Hyde Park, which they had bought from a previous owner, and expanded into something of considerable grandeur. The Livingstons, one of the oldest of the old money families, had Claremont, which had been in the family since the 17th century, a fact that gave it a weight of history that Newport's marble confections could not match. The Roosevelts had Springwood, at Hyde Park as well, a house of modest scale by the standards of the era but surrounded by farmland and woodland that the family had worked for generations. These Hudson Valley estates spoke of a different kind of wealth, inherited, rooted, unself-conscious. The families who owned them were not trying to prove anything. They had already arrived, or believed they had, at a place so established that display was unnecessary. Their houses were furnished with inherited pieces, their walls hung with family portraits, their libraries stocked with books that had been read. On summer weekends at these estates the rhythm was agricultural as much as social. There were farms to be checked on, cattle to be counted, gardens to be walked. The men might spend the morning on horseback, not for show, but simply because it was the way they had always moved through their land. The women might supervise the kitchen gardens or the flower arrangements, or in some cases read. Actually read for hours, in comfortable chairs on shaded porches. This was leisure of a different order from Newport's, less observed, less performed. But both kinds of leisure shared something essential: the assumption of permanence, the sense that this, the house, the land, the staff, the silver, the beautiful order of things, would continue. The house at rest, the day not yet begun, the world quiet and full of promise. Let the image settle, let the sound of the sea or the river or the wind through the old trees come and find you where you rest. We will move deeper into this world now. We will follow the day as it unfolds. Slowly. Without hurry. A bedroom in a great Gilded Age house was not like the bedrooms most of us know. It was a suite of rooms, really, a small domestic world within the larger domestic world of the house itself. There was the bedchamber proper, which in the grandest houses was a room of considerable size, its walls covered in silk damask or hand-painted wallpaper, its ceiling decorated with plasterwork or, in the very grandest cases, with painted scenes from mythology or allegory. The bed itself was often a monumental piece of furniture, a carved mahogany four-poster with a canopy, or a gilded French sleigh bed, or a vast Elizabethan thing of oak and brocade, depending on the taste and the era and the aspirations of the family who had chosen it. Adjoining the bedchamber was the dressing room, which in the houses of the truly wealthy was a room of its own, equipped with wardrobes of built-in mahogany, a dressing table with a triple mirror, a padded chair, and sometimes a small fireplace. In the houses of the wealthiest families, a lady's dressing room might also contain a writing desk, a bookshelf, and a chaise longue, making it a private sitting room as much as a place of preparation. Then there was the bathroom, which in these houses was something extraordinary by the standards of any era. The great bathroom of the Gilded Age was tiled in marble or imported ceramics, fitted with a bathtub of enamelled cast iron large enough to swim in, and equipped with elaborate plumbing that delivered hot water from a boiler in the basement at the turn of a tap. This was, in the context of the time, a profound luxury. For most people in America in the 1890s, hot water meant heating it on a stove and carrying it in buckets. For the inhabitants of these great houses, it arrived magically, at any hour, in any quantity. On a weekend morning, the ritual of waking was unhurried almost to the point of ceremony. A lady of the house might expect her personal maid, her lady's maid, to appear in the bedchamber at whatever hour had been agreed upon, usually somewhere between 9 and 10 in the morning, carrying a breakfast tray. The tray would hold a pot of tea or coffee, a rack of toast, perhaps a soft-boiled egg and a dish of marmalade, a small vase of fresh flowers clipped from the garden, and a folded copy of the morning newspaper, or, if the household subscribed to it, one of the fashionable society papers. The lady might eat her breakfast in bed, or in the small sitting room adjoining the bedchamber, while the maid opened the curtains, heavy silk curtains, lined against both light and cold, and assessed the weather. In Newport in summer, the weather was almost always consulted. The social calendar of the place was organised around it to a degree that seems almost obsessive from a modern vantage point. Whether to take a carriage drive along Bellevue Avenue depended on the weather. Whether to sail depended on the weather. Whether to host the afternoon's lawn party out of doors or under awnings depended on the weather. The maid would offer observations on this subject. The clouds were lifting in the east. The wind had turned. It would be a fine afternoon. Or conversely, the fog was still heavy. There was the smell of rain. It might be advisable to plan for the drawing room. These conversations, which seem so small, were in fact the first negotiations of the day. The Gilded Age weekend was a place of enormous social complexity, and even its mornings required management. For the gentlemen of the household, the morning ritual was somewhat different. A valet would appear at the appointed hour, somewhat earlier, typically, than the ladies, since the men often rode or walked before breakfast. The valet laid out the day's clothes, not formal dress, which was reserved for the evenings, but the comfortable country clothes that were the appropriate costume of Gilded Age leisure. Tweed suits, well fitted and of good quality. Flannel trousers, straw boater hats, or if riding, the appropriate equestrian dress. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who was by most accounts a serious and somewhat solemn man, typically rose early, conducted his morning correspondence. He was never entirely off duty from business, even in Newport, and then walked with his wife Alice to the Cliff Walk, the famous public path that ran along the edge of the bluffs above the sea, before returning to the breakers for breakfast with the family and whatever guests were in residence. William Waldorf Astor, who was richer than most people could imagine and more eccentric than most people could tolerate, spent his mornings in his private study with his books and his correspondence, emerging for breakfast with the air of a man who has already accomplished a great deal before anyone else has quite woken up. Alva Vanderbilt, who later became Alva Belmont after her divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt, was by all contemporary accounts a figure of tremendous energy even in leisure. She was up early, inspecting the gardens, consulting with her head gardener, revising the social arrangements for the day. She was not a woman to whom idleness came naturally, and her weekends, even at Marble House, had the quality of organised campaigns. But these were the exceptions, or the variations. For most of the residents of Newport's great houses, the Saturday morning drifted. Imagine the morning room, which in most of these houses was positioned to catch the early light. It was furnished more lightly than the formal reception rooms, wicker chairs perhaps, or upholstered settees in lighter fabrics. There were writing tables for correspondence, and correspondence was a serious occupation in this world, letters written with care, folded and sealed, dispatched by hand. There were newspapers and fashion magazines. There were sometimes needlework or sketching materials for the ladies who occupied themselves that way. There were potted ferns and palms, which the Victorians loved with a particular intensity, placing them in every available corner and window embrasure. The sound of a Gilded Age morning room, the rustle of a newspaper, the clink of a cup replaced in its saucer, the soft tread of a footman refilling a coffee cup without being asked, the distant sound of the sea, always the sea, drifting through the partly opened windows, the cry of a bird, the faint jingle of harness from the stables. The smell of a Gilded Age morning room, coffee and toast and flowers and something underneath that is harder to name but has to do with old wood and good wool and fresh air and beeswax, the smell of a house that is very well kept. Children, where they were present, were sometimes visible at this hour, though more often they were in the care of nurses and governesses on the upper floors. The Gilded Age was not an era in which wealthy parents spent a great deal of time in the company of their young children. The children had their own world, a nursery, a schoolroom, a nanny, a governess, a cook who prepared their simpler meals. They appeared downstairs for brief formal visits, to say good morning to their parents, or to be presented to guests, and then retreated again to their own domain. This sounds colder than it probably felt to the children who lived it. They had companions, games, walks, a kind of freedom within their bounded world that was real even if it was supervised. And the houses they grew up in were full of places to explore. Attic rooms, back staircases, garden paths, stable yards where horses and grooms and cats and dogs made a rich and interesting world. But we are drifting through the morning of the adults, and the morning is still early. Outside, the lawn is wet with dew. The roses in the formal garden have opened in the night, and their scent drifts across the terrace. A gardener moves methodically along the borders, doing something careful and unhurried with his hands. The day is just beginning to warm. The social machinery is not yet in motion. For a little while longer, for another hour, perhaps two, the house belongs only to itself and to the quiet morning. Let yourself sink into that quiet now. Feel the imagined weight of fine linen sheets, the sound of the sea outside, constant and rhythmic, the smell of coffee and flowers, the soft light through the curtains. There is no hurry. There is never any hurry here. In the great houses of the Gilded Age, breakfast was not a meal, it was a statement. This requires some explanation, because the breakfast habits of the very wealthy in this era were different from what we might expect, different, in fact, from the elaborate multi-course extravagances of the dinner table. Breakfast in a Gilded Age household was, by the standards of the other meals, almost modest, but even modesty, when expressed in terms of the finest china and the freshest ingredients and the most attentive service, becomes its own kind of splendour. The typical arrangement for a Saturday morning breakfast in a house of the first rank was a buffet set out in the dining room or, in summer, on the veranda or in the morning room, from which guests and family could serve themselves, or rather, could indicate to a footman what they wished to eat, and have it delivered to them at the table. The sideboard would be spread with covered silver dishes, kedgeree, a warming mixture of flaked fish and rice and hard-boiled eggs and curry spice, which was a breakfast dish of the era with its origins in the Anglo-Indian tradition. Sausages, herbed and fine, sliced cold ham or cold tongue, kidneys in their various preparations, a platter of thin sliced smoked salmon, scrambled eggs, very soft, cooked with cream, poached eggs on toast, devilled kidneys for those who like to sharper flavour in the morning. There would be bread, toast made from fine-grained white bread, water biscuits, corn muffins in the American fashion, perhaps a basket of fresh rolls still warm from the oven, butter in a silver pot, cold and firm, several varieties of marmalade and jam, orange marmalade, strawberry jam, raspberry conserve, quince jelly of an amber colour. There would be fruit, a dish of peaches if it was high summer and the peaches were good, a bowl of strawberries with a small pitcher of cream, sliced melon, compote of apricots or figs. To drink, coffee from a silver pot kept warm on a spirit lamp, tea in a second pot, loose leaf, properly brewed, not a thing to be rushed, chocolate for those who preferred it, iced water, orange juice freshly squeezed, an elaborate production in an era before electric juicers, handled entirely in the kitchen with considerable effort. The silver. These households had silver in quantities that strained the imagination. Not just the practical pieces, the coffee pots and cream jugs, the sugar bowls and solvers, the sauce boats and ladles, but decorative pieces that had been accumulated over generations, candlesticks and epergnes and fruit baskets and rose bowls. At the great dinner tables, the silver and crystal could render the room into something approaching the effect of a well-lit night sky, all reflections and glitter. At the breakfast table, the effect was more restrained, but the silver was still there. The toast rack, the egg cups, the marmalade jar with its little spoon, the coffee pot with its warming stand. The china on which this breakfast was served was not ordinary china. The families of the Gilded Age collected porcelain with the same competitive intensity they brought to collecting paintings or acquiring real estate. The Vanderbilts had dinner services from the Limoges manufactory that had been specially made for them, decorated with their initials and an elaborate border. The Astors had Chinese export porcelain that was 200 years old, delicate as eggshell, painted with scenes of imperial life in faded blues and reds and golds. The Belmonts had Sèvres, the most prestigious of all European porcelains, pieces that had once belonged to the French royal family and had survived the Revolution and multiple changes of ownership to come to rest, finally, on an American breakfast table in Newport, Rhode Island. Sitting down to breakfast in one of these houses was therefore a sensory experience of considerable richness. The sight of the gleaming table, the smell of coffee and fresh bread and sausages and flowers, the sound of quiet conversation, and the soft movements of the serving staff, the weight of good china and real silver in the hand, all of this added up to something that was more than the sum of its parts. It was the feeling of being very well taken care of existing in a world where every detail had been considered by someone else, where nothing was left to chance, where the very best of what was available had been assembled for your comfort and pleasure. This feeling, this sensation of being tended, was perhaps the true luxury of the Gilded Age. Money could buy things, houses, furniture, horses, paintings, jewels. But what the very rich were really purchasing, in all their elaborate expenditure on staff and service and ritual, was this: the experience of moving through the world as though it had been arranged for you, as though you were, at some fundamental level, expected, anticipated, prepared for. Let that feeling drift over you now, the table set for you, the coffee exactly as you like it, the bread warm, the morning light coming through the windows at the right angle, falling on the white linen in a way that seems almost deliberate. Outside, a carriage has drawn up on the gravel drive. Someone is arriving or departing. The sound of hooves on stone, and then the sound fades. Inside, the conversation at the breakfast table is unhurried and easy. Someone is reading aloud from the newspaper, not the political news, which is too heavy for a Saturday morning, but the society column, who was seen at what party last night, who has arrived in Newport for the season, what is expected this coming week. Someone else is making plans, a picnic lunch on the yacht, a drive up to the casino for the tennis tournament in the afternoon, or perhaps simply a morning on the terrace with a book and then a late lunch, and then, well, the afternoon will arrange itself. The morning is long and full of possibility. The coffee is hot. The bread is fresh. And there is absolutely nowhere that anyone needs to be. In the households of the new money, the Vanderbilts, the Belmonts, the Astors of the second generation, breakfast was taken with a certain deliberate formality, a consciousness that the forms of the occasion mattered. In the households of the old money, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, the Roosevelts, breakfast was often a quieter, more domestic affair, eaten in a smaller room, with less ceremony but perhaps more genuine ease. But in both cases the food itself was plentiful and good. This was, after all, an era before the calorie-counting anxieties of later decades. The Gilded Age ate with appetite and without guilt. The men who had built railroads and steel mills and banking empires were substantial physical beings, and they ate accordingly. The women who managed vast households and orchestrated social campaigns that would have taxed a general's nerves also ate with something like enthusiasm, though convention required them to be somewhat more restrained in public. The children, if they appeared at breakfast, which in some households they did, in others they did not, were given simpler food, porridge, perhaps, or bread and butter and honey, and a glass of milk, and perhaps an egg. Their presence was always somewhat provisional, dependent on the mood of the morning and the presence or absence of house guests. On a quiet weekend morning without guests, the children might eat with their parents in something approaching a normal domestic scene. When guests were in residence, the children remained upstairs with the nursery staff. After breakfast, the day opened up. The options were many, and we will follow them one by one as the morning deepens and the sun climbs above the Tuckahoe marble and the shingled rooftops and the tall elms that line the drives of Newport's great estates. But not yet. For now, let the breakfast table hold you. The coffee cooling slightly in the cup, the last piece of toast, the morning light shifting as a cloud passes over the sun and then returning, warm and clear, to fall again on the white linen. There is time. There is so much time. If you were very rich in the Gilded Age and it was a Saturday morning in late summer and the weather was what the Newport morning paper had called excellent for driving, the most likely thing to happen after breakfast was this: you would go to the stable. Horses were the central technology of the Gilded Age in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate now. Before the automobile, which did not begin to make its presence felt among the wealthy until the very end of the century, the horse was everything. It was transportation, and it was sport, and it was status, and it was aesthetic pleasure, and it was, for a great many men of the era, the deepest and most genuine passion of their lives. The stables of the great Newport houses were remarkable structures in themselves. The Vanderbilt family's stable at the Breakers was built to accommodate a large number of horses, their carriages, and the staff required to care for both. The stable at Belcourt Castle was extraordinary by any measure. Oliver Hazard, Perry Belmont, who had inherited considerable money and then considerably increased it, was so devoted to his horses that he had Richard Morris Hunt design a stable that was essentially a palace for equines. The ground floor of Belcourt was given over almost entirely to the stable. The horses slept in carved oak stalls with brass fittings and Turkish rugs. The ceiling of the stable was coffered. There were hanging lanterns of wrought iron. The horses lived, it was often remarked, better than most people. On a Saturday morning in season, Bellevue Avenue and the Ocean Drive were the great theatre of the Newport carriage parade. This was an institution, the daily procession of the wealthy driving their finest equipages along the prescribed routes, seeing and being seen, exchanging nods and conversations and assessments. The serious drivers were those who drove four in hand, which means a carriage drawn by 4 horses, handled by the driver from the box seat. This was a skilled business, requiring years of practice and genuine physical ability. The reins of a 4 in hand are gathered in a complex arrangement in the driver's left hand, and the management of 4 horses, each with its own personality and movement, while navigating roads and traffic and the social demands of the carriage parade, was an accomplishment that commanded real respect even among people who were not themselves drivers. Coaching, driving a coach and 4, was the great sporting passion of a certain segment of Gilded Age male society. It had begun as an English aristocratic enthusiasm and migrated to America along with so much else that the American wealthy admired in British upper-class life. By the 1880s, there were coaching clubs in New York and Newport, and the weekend coaching parades were important social events in themselves. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, not the Cornelius Vanderbilt who built the breakers, but his nephew of a later generation, born in 1877 and heir to a considerable portion of the Vanderbilt fortune, became one of the most accomplished amateur coachmen in America. He drove a coach and four on the Brighton Road in England and on various American roads, and his skill was acknowledged as genuine, not merely the enthusiasm of a rich man who could afford the best equipment. He drove with what contemporary observers called a light hand, a quality prized above all others in the handling of horses, the ability to communicate with the animals through the reins without force, with a subtle, continuous conversation between human and horse. Let yourself imagine the Saturday coaching parade on Bellevue Avenue. It is late morning, approaching noon. The sun is full now, warm and bright, and the ocean breeze that makes Newport bearable in high summer is blowing in from the south, carrying the smell of salt water and cut grass. The elms that line Bellevue Avenue cast a dappled shade across the road, and the gravel is smooth and firm from the previous day's maintenance by the road crew. Newport's roads were kept in excellent condition during the summer season, which was a matter of civic pride and social necessity. The first carriages are appearing, a light Victoria, open to the sky, drawn by a matched pair of bays, driven by a coachman in livery while the two ladies inside lean together in some easy conversation. Behind it, a heavier landau drawn by four greys, the family crest painted on the door, the footman holding his position at the rear with practised stillness. Then a dog-cart driven by a young man in tweed who handles his single horse with the casual ease of someone who has been doing this since childhood. And among them, the four in hands. The great coaches, built by the finest carriage makers in New York and London, their varnished panels gleaming in the sun, their brass fittings polished to a mirror finish, their horses matched in colour and gait, their drivers on the box with the reins gathered in the proper coaching grip, the long coaching whip in the right hand, the whole apparatus of skill and wealth and tradition moving down the avenue at a smart trot. The sound of it, hooves on gravel in that particular rhythm that is four horses trotting, a complex rolling percussion, the creak of well-sprung coaches, the jingle of harness, the calling of greetings between carriages as they pass and slow and pass again. The occasional horn of a coaching guard, a theatrical touch, but one that belonged to the tradition. The smell of it, horses and leather and harness oil and something like autumn leaves even in high summer, the smell of horse sweat and dust and the perfume of the ladies in the open carriages. This was theatre, but it was also genuine pleasure. The people in these carriages were not miserable. They were, on the whole, having a fine time. Some of them were accomplished horsewomen as well as horsemen. Driving was not exclusively a male domain in this era. Women drove their own light vehicles, a phaeton, a spider phaeton, a dog-cart, with skill and evident enjoyment. The roads of Newport in summer were populated with ladies who drove themselves, a practice that combined independence and display in a way that seems modern. For those who preferred to ride rather than drive, there was the morning hack along the cliff walk or through the paths of the interior of Aquinic Island, where the land opened up into farmland and the riding was easy and pleasant. The horses brought to Newport for the summer season were the best in their respective owners' stables. Hunters and thoroughbreds and well-bred carriage horses, carefully prepared and in excellent condition. The care of these horses occupied a small army of people. A large Newport stable might employ a head coachman, several under-coachmen, a head groom, several grooms and stable boys, a blacksmith, a harness maker, and various other ancillary staff. The feeding, exercising, grooming, harnessing, and medical care of the horses was a continuous operation. The horses were bathed regularly, their coats brushed to a high sheen, their hooves blacked, their manes and tails dressed. They ate well, hay, oats, bran, occasional treats, and were exercised daily even when they were not needed for driving. In the stables themselves, on a Saturday morning when the horses are being prepared for the day's driving, there is a particular quality of activity that has the feel of skilled craftsmanship. The grooms move efficiently and quietly around the horses, who stand with the calm familiarity of animals who know their handlers well. The smell of the stable, hay and horse and leather and something metallic from the harness fittings, is warm and intimate. and then the horses are brought out into the stable yard, blinking in the sunlight, their breath making small clouds in the cool morning air if the season is late enough, or simply standing quietly in the warmth if it is full summer. The carriage is brought around, the harness is applied with practiced efficiency, and then the whole apparatus, horse, carriage, harness, driver, footman, moves out through the stable gate and onto the gravel drive, and the Saturday driving has begun. There is something deeply peaceful about this image. The horse in motion, the rhythm of hooves, the road unfolding ahead, the open sky. Let it carry you forward a little. The morning is moving toward noon. Newport was, before all other things, a place of the sea. The town had been a working port long before it became a pleasure ground for the very wealthy, and even in the height of the Gilded Age the water remained the central fact of life there. Not merely a backdrop for the houses on the bluffs, but an active element, used and explored and competed over with an enthusiasm that bordered on the obsessive. The New York Yacht Club, founded in 1844, had its summer station at Newport, and the Ida Lewis Yacht Club, named for the famous lighthouse keeper who had rescued numerous sailors over the decades, was also active there. But the institution that mattered most to the Gilded Age summer colony was the Newport Yacht Club, and above all the races. The America's Cup, which had begun in 1851 when the schooner America sailed to England and defeated the entire British fleet in a race around the Isle of Wight, was by the late 19th century the most prestigious yacht race in the world, and it was contested off the coast of Newport. The challenge races brought the very wealthiest men in America, and a few from Britain, into direct public competition, in a sport that was as much a test of design and construction and naval science as it was of sailing skill. Cornelius Vanderbilt III did not race in the America's Cup, but his cousins and peers did. William Kissam Vanderbilt was an enthusiastic yachtsman. J.P. Morgan, the banker who was arguably the most powerful private individual in America in the 1890s and early 1900s, owned a succession of increasingly magnificent yachts, each one named Corsair, and he spent considerable time aboard them. William K. Vanderbilt Jr. raced motorboats and yachts with equal enthusiasm. But the America's Cup itself was dominated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by a single figure. Cornelius Vanderbilt III was not the yachtsman of his family. That distinction belonged to several cousins. The man who dominated the cup races in this era was Sir Thomas Lipton, a self-made British grocer of Irish birth who had made a fortune in tea, who challenged 5 times between 1899 and 1930, and lost all 5 races, earning for himself an immortality of sympathetic affection from the American public that his millions had not quite managed to purchase. The great yacht races were public spectacles. On the days of the cup races, the waters off Newport were crowded with spectator vessels of every description. Steam launches, sailboats, excursion steamers packed with regular people who had travelled from New York and Providence for the occasion. The race itself took place on a course some miles offshore, but the spectators who could get close enough could watch the competing yachts, which were by any measure astonishing objects. Vast, slender, overpowered racing machines, their sails spread like wings, moving at speeds that seemed impossible for vessels of their size. But we are not at a race today. Today is a quiet Saturday, and what the wealthy of Newport are doing with the sea is not competition, but pleasure. The private steam yacht was the luxury object of the Gilded Age, the equivalent in many ways of the private jet of a later era. J.P. Morgan's Corsair IV, which he commissioned in 1899, was a vessel of 343 feet, with a crew of several dozen, capable of crossing the Atlantic in reasonable comfort. It was fitted with every luxury available: a library, a dining saloon, private cabins for guests, a smoking room, and a full kitchen. Morgan used the Corsair partly as a means of transportation. He sailed it to Europe more than once, but also as what he called his office. He conducted important business meetings aboard, the privacy and mobility of the yacht allowing him to avoid the press and the public in ways that a hotel room could not. The private steam yacht in general was valued precisely for this quality of inaccessibility. On a yacht at sea you were unreachable. Telegrams could not find you, visitors could not appear. The social obligations that governed life on shore, the morning calls, the afternoon teas, the dinner invitations that had to be accepted or gracefully declined, did not apply. On a yacht, you were free. Or at least you were free in the way that the very wealthy of the Gilded Age understood freedom. surrounded by staff and comfort, moving through the world on your own schedule, accountable to no one. On a Saturday morning in season, the harbour at Newport would be full of yachts, steam yachts in the larger sizes, anchored in the deep water of the harbour, sailing yachts of various dimensions from the great racing schooners to the comfortable cruising ketches and sloops used for day sailing. The harbour was a beautiful place, full of movement and the smell of salt and diesel smoke from the steam launches that ferried passengers between the moored yachts and the docks. To go out on the water on a Saturday morning was one of the great pleasures of the Newport season. The invitation might come at breakfast. "We thought we'd take the Alicia out this morning if the wind holds. Will you come?" The Alicia, or the Nymph, or the Wakiva, or the Electra, or whatever the yacht was called, was available, crewed and ready, and the morning stretched ahead with the particular promise that only the sea can offer. The departure was a production in itself. The steam launch came from the moored yacht to the landing at the Ida Lewis Yacht Club, or to a private dock if the house had one. The guests descended from the dock into the launch, ladies first, handed down carefully into the gently rocking boat, and then the launch crossed the harbour with its distinctive low throb of an engine to where the yacht waited at anchor. Coming aboard a great steam yacht for the first time was an experience that impressed itself on the memory. The deck was teak, scrubbed white and smooth. The brass fittings were polished to a brilliance that made you want to shade your eyes. The deck house, painted white or cream, with its lines of portholes and its covered spaces for relaxing in the wind, was a different world from the shore, cooler, freer, smelling of salt water and engine oil, and something cleaner and more elemental than anything available on land. Below decks, the saloon was panelled in mahogany or bird's-eye maple, furnished with built-in settees upholstered in leather or velvet, a writing table, a bookcase with brass rods to hold the books in place against the motion of the sea. There were oil paintings bolted securely to the walls. There was a gramophone, perhaps, in a corner. The dining saloon was smaller but equally refined. A table of polished wood, chairs that swivelled to accommodate the motion of the sea, a sideboard with its crystal decanters held in place by silver racks. On a Saturday, on a fine sailing day, the yacht might head out into Narragansett Bay, threading through the islands, Connecticut to the west, Prudence beyond it, the low green shape of Connecticut framing the wide water to the south. The wind in summer comes from the southwest, reliable and cool, and under sail or with the engine at an easy speed, the yacht would move through the bay with that particular feeling that is unique to being on the water, the sense of the world reorganized, of distance and speed and weight recalibrated, of ordinary concerns becoming distant and theoretical. Lunch would be served on deck if the weather was fine, or in the saloon if there was any sea. The steward, for yachts of this size had their own household staff, distinct from the sailing crew, would produce something appropriate to the occasion. Cold poached salmon with a cucumber sauce perhaps, and cold roast beef and a salad and a cold raspberry tart, and wine from the cool of the ship's cellar. After lunch, in the warmth of the early afternoon, some of the guests might doze in deck chairs under the awning while others fished, or simply watched the water. The coast of Rhode Island in summer, seen from the water, is a landscape of green islands and rocky shores and the occasional white spire of a village church, and it is beautiful in a way that does not ask to be commented upon. It simply is. The return to Newport in the late afternoon, with the sun lowering and the harbour filling again with the golden light that Newport evenings are famous for, was a moment of quiet completion. The day had been spent well. The sea had offered what it always offers: perspective, freshness, the humbling reminder that the world is larger than any house, however grand. On the dock the carriages would be waiting, and the house, with its preparations for the evening already underway, would be ready to receive them. But we are not there yet. Let the water hold us a little longer. The sound of the sea against the hull, the creak of the rigging, the wind, the light. Breathe. If the horses and the yachts were the domains of serious wealth and serious sport, there was another institution at the heart of Gilded Age Newport leisure that combined athleticism with social performance in a way that was entirely characteristic of the age: the Newport Casino. The Newport Casino, whose name confusingly had nothing to do with gambling, it derives from the Italian word for a small country house, was founded in 1880 and designed by McKim, Mead and White, the firm that was, along with Richard Morris Hunt, the most important architectural practice in Gilded Age America. The casino was a social club, a place for the summer colony to gather for recreation and entertainment. It occupied a city block on Bellevue Avenue, and it included within its complex a theatre, a reading room, a bowling alley, a court tennis court, and most importantly grass lawn tennis courts. Lawn tennis was, in the 1880s and 1890s, the newest of fashionable sports. It had been invented in Britain in the 1870s and had spread with remarkable speed through the English-speaking world's upper classes, who adopted it with the enthusiasm that wealth and leisure make possible. By the time the Newport Casino opened, tennis was already established as the sport of the season, and the casino's courts were its central arena. The first US National Championships, which would eventually become the US Open, were held at the Newport Casino in 1881, and the event continued there for many years. On tournament weekends, the casino was the focus of the entire colony's attention. The grandstands that surrounded the centre court were filled with the summer residents and their guests, dressed in the specific idiom of spectator wear that the occasion required. Summer whites and pale pastels, straw hats and parasols, the whole visual vocabulary of Gilded Age leisure at its most concentrated. But on a quiet Saturday when there was no tournament, the casino courts were simply where people went to play. And the Saturday morning tennis match was one of the great institutions of Newport social life. The tennis of the era was not quite the game we know today. The rackets were heavier, the balls somewhat different, the courts maintained with a care that made the grass smooth as a carpet. The dress code was elaborate by modern standards. Men played in long white flannel trousers and white shirts, with a blazer worn to and from the court and discarded for play. Women played in full-length skirts, shirtwaists, and sometimes a flannel jacket, with canvas shoes and a hatpin securing their hat against the wind. The movement required in this clothing was somewhat restricted by our standards, and women's tennis of the era reflected this. More baseline rallying, less running, a game of placement and patience rather than power and speed. But it was genuine tennis, and it was played with genuine enthusiasm. Richard Sears, who won the US National Championship 7 consecutive times between 1881 and 1887, was a product of this world. He was a Bostonian of good family, educated at Harvard, and his tennis was the expression of a certain ideal of athletic grace. Controlled, economical, tactically intelligent. He did not play with power but with placement, hitting the ball to exactly where his opponent was not. This style of play, which the French called doux or gentle, was considered by many contemporaries to be the highest form of the game. On a Saturday morning at the casino, the courts would be occupied from mid-morning with a succession of matches, informal but taken seriously, conducted with the particular seriousness that polite people bring to competitions they are determined not to appear too competitive about. Beyond the casino, tennis was played on the private lawns of the great houses. Almost every major Newport estate had a tennis court. Some had several, and the private match was, in some ways, more relaxed and more revealing than the public court at the casino. Among friends, on one's own lawn, the social performance was somewhat simplified, and the playing could be more earnest. Croquet was another outdoor game that occupied a significant place in the Gilded Age leisure calendar, though it had perhaps its greatest popularity somewhat earlier in the century. By the 1890s, croquet was considered a slightly old-fashioned entertainment, appropriate for afternoon garden parties and for older guests who found tennis too strenuous, but not quite at the cutting edge of fashionable sport. It was, nonetheless, a pleasant way to spend a Saturday afternoon, and the croquet lawns of the great estates were maintained with the same care as the tennis courts. The archery range was another fixture of certain estates. Archery had undergone a revival in the later 19th century, partly because it was one of the few athletic activities that women could engage in outdoors, while maintaining the full dignity of their dress, and partly because it had an attractive association with medieval romance. Archery tournaments were held at various Newport estates, sometimes as serious competitions and sometimes as the excuse for garden parties, in which the archery was incidental to the socializing. Field polo, played on horseback, was the most demanding and the most aristocratic of the weekend sports. The polo grounds at Newport were among the finest in America, and the Saturday afternoon polo match was a major social event. The players, who had to be accomplished horsemen as well as technically skilled at polo, wore white breeches and coloured jerseys, and rode ponies that were specially trained for the sport, quick and responsive, and seemingly indifferent to the chaos of the game. The spectators at a Newport polo match were a social gathering in themselves. The carriages were lined up along the edge of the field, and the women among the spectators were on the carriages, seated on the high box seats or standing in the carriage to see over the crowd, while the men walked the sidelines and occasionally shouted encouragement. The atmosphere was louder and more demonstrative than the casino's carefully modulated applause, and there was a physical excitement to the polo ground. The thundering hooves, the crack of the mallet, the shout of the crowd when a goal was scored, that was different from the more refined excitement of tennis. After the polo match, the late afternoon would bring the social gathering to the veranda of whatever house was hosting the day's entertainment, and the conversation would turn from the game to the evening's arrangements. Who was giving a dinner? Was the Ulrichs ball still on for the following Wednesday? Had you seen the roses at Marble House this week? They were perfectly extraordinary. The day was winding toward its most important hours. But before we arrive at the evening, let us rest in the afternoon a little longer. The sun is lower now, and the light has that particular quality of late summer afternoons, golden and slightly hazy, that makes every object, the white lawn chairs, the green net of the tennis court, the yellow roses climbing the stone wall of the kitchen garden, appear to be gently illuminated from within. Someone has brought out lemonade and thin sandwiches and set them on a table under the elm trees. The players have finished their game and are sitting in the grass, their white flannels marked with green, their faces pleasantly tired. The conversation is easy, drifting from subject to subject without urgency. Somebody has a theory about why the roses are particularly good this year. Someone else has received a letter from a friend in Europe. The children have appeared from somewhere and are running in the lower garden, their voices carrying up the hill. The afternoon, the lawn, the light. Let it settle around you. Evening came to Newport with a particular quality of light. The sun dropping toward the hills of the mainland to the west, the sky above the Atlantic turning from blue to rose to amber, and then the long summer twilight that lingered until nearly 9 o'clock, so that the lamps in the great houses were lit not against darkness, but against the fading of a very beautiful sky. In the houses on the cliff, dinner began at 8 or half past. In some houses, at 9. The exact hour varied by household and by the preference of the hostess, but it was never earlier than 8, because to dine before 8 was to confess a domestic informality that was not quite appropriate to the greatest houses, and it was never later than 9:30, because the kitchen staff, however stoically they accepted the demands placed upon them, had physical limits, and the cooking of a Gilded Age dinner was an operation that required planning and timing of considerable precision. In the hour or two before dinner, the guests gathered for what was sometimes called the small hour, the time between the end of the afternoon's activities and the formal commencement of the evening. During this interval, the public rooms of the house were available for informal socializing. There might be music in the drawing room, a pianist playing something light and pleasant in the background. There was always something to drink, champagne in coolers, or cocktails. The cocktail was a novelty of the era, enthusiastically adopted by the American wealthy, or lemonade for those who preferred it. The guests would be in their dinner dress. For the men, this meant white tie and tailcoat, which in the 1880s and 1890s was the standard evening wear for all formal occasions. The tailcoat was black, the waistcoat white, the shirt front stiffly starched. The black satin tie was tied by the valet, or, in the case of those who took pride in dressing themselves, tied with considerable care before the dressing-room mirror. The effect for a well-built man in proper evening dress was of a certain clean elegance, formal, standardized, collective. It said, "I am a member of this world." For the women, the calculation was more complex and more individual. Evening dress in the Gilded Age was an elaborate production, requiring the assistance of the lady's maid, and sometimes, for the most complicated gowns, 2 or 3 maids working together. The gowns of the era were made by the great Parisian couturiers, Worth, Paquin, Doucet, or by American houses working in the Parisian tradition. They were constructed of silk, velvet, satin, chiffon, sometimes decorated with lace or embroidery, cut to show the shoulders and the upper chest while covering the arms and the lower body in a way that balanced revelation and concealment according to the precise social mathematics of the era. The jewels of the Gilded Age were extraordinary objects. The women who wore them had between them assembled collections that rivaled those of European royalty. Alva Vanderbilt's diamonds, which she wore to her famous costume ball of 1883, had been valued at several $100,000, at a time when the average American industrial worker earned less than $500 a year. Mrs. William B. Astor, the acknowledged queen of New York society, wore a stomacher of diamonds at her formal entertainments that had been made in Paris and was considered one of the finest pieces of jewellery in America. These jewels were not merely decoration, they were investment, inheritance, and statement simultaneously. The woman who wore a parure of diamonds to a Newport dinner in 1890 was doing several things at once, demonstrating the wealth of her household, participating in the visual language of her social class, and asserting her position within the intricate hierarchy of that class. The rankings were precise. Some women wore more impressive jewels than others, and this was noted, and it mattered. But we're ahead of ourselves. The guests are still gathering. The champagne is still cold. The evening light is still warm in the tall windows. Dinner in a great Gilded Age house was served in the French style, à la Russe, which means that the food was brought out in successive courses rather than set out all at once on the table. And the number of courses at a formal dinner could reach 10 or 12, occasionally more. At Mrs. Astor's annual dinners in New York, which were the model to which all other hostesses aspired, the number of covers was set at 400, the famous 400, the number that could fit comfortably in her ballroom, which Ward McAllister, her social arbiter, had decreed to be the effective size of New York society. In Newport, where the scale of even the grandest houses was somewhat more intimate than the great townhouses of New York, the dinner for 50 or 60 was more typical than the dinner for 400. But even a dinner for 50, conducted in the Gilded Age style, was an event of considerable complexity and expense. The table itself was an artwork. The linens, Irish linen bleached white, ironed to a surface that was almost glossy, were laid flat, and over them were placed the multiple layers of cutlery, glassware, and china that the successive courses required. In the grandest houses, each place setting might include 6 or 7 glasses of different sizes, corresponding to the wines that would be served with each course. The cutlery was heavy silver, polished to a brilliance that caught the light of the candles, and candles remained the primary light source for the grandest Gilded Age dinner tables, even after electric light had been installed elsewhere in the houses, because candlelight was understood to be more becoming and more romantic. The centerpieces were elaborate, floral arrangements of a scale and artifice that were considered a measure of the household's resources, or epergons of silver and crystal holding fresh fruit, or elaborate confections of spun sugar and marzipan that were designed to be admired rather than eaten. The table of the Gilded Age dinner was a complete aesthetic environment. The guests sat according to a protocol of considerable intricacy. The hostess sat at one end of the table, the host at the other. The most honoured female guest sat to the host's right, the most honoured male guest to the hostess's right. The remaining guests were arranged according to a hierarchy that took into account social rank, marital status, age, and the requirements of conversation. A man and a woman alternating always, because that was how it was done. The first course was soup, a consommé of great clarity and depth of flavour, served in shallow plates consumed quickly. The second course might be fish, a poached salmon, or a sole in a cream sauce, or a lobster preparation of some complexity. Then came what the menus of the era called the removes, the roasted meats, the joints, the birds, a saddle of lamb, a roasted fillet of beef with its sauces, a brace of canvas-back ducks which were the luxury waterfowl of the era, prized for their flavour and difficult to obtain, a roast chicken, a partridge. Between the heavier courses came what were called the entree, not the American main course, but lighter, more delicate preparations in the French tradition. A sweetbread in pastry, a mousse of foie gras, a tartlet of asparagus with hollandaise. These were the dishes that demonstrated the technical accomplishment of the kitchen, the ability to produce the lighter, more intricate French style, alongside the robust Anglo-American tradition of roasted meats. Then came salad. Then came the desserts, ices of various flavours, served in silver cups, pastries from the confectionery, a moulded pudding of some architectural ambition, and finally the cheese and the fruit and the coffee. The wines tracked the courses, a light white wine with the fish, a heavier red with the meats, champagne throughout or at intervals, a sauterne with the desserts, perhaps a port or a Madeira with the cheese and fruit. The sommelier, or, in those households that did not maintain one, the butler, was responsible for the wine service, which was a matter of technical knowledge as well as physical skill. Through all of this, the conversation moved. And conversation at a Gilded Age dinner table was itself a performance, governed by implicit rules that every guest understood. You spoke to the person on your right during the first part of the dinner, and then, at some unspoken signal from the hostess, you turned and spoke to the person on your left. You did not talk about business, not because business was shameful, but because it was considered inappropriate to the occasion. You did not talk about religion or politics with any candour, because these were subjects that divided people. You talked about society, about people, about events, about travel, about art and music and literature in a light, informed, entertaining way that showed you had opinions without making anyone feel challenged. The great conversationalists of the Gilded Age were prized social assets. A man who could be witty without being cruel, informed without being pedantic, interested in his companions without appearing to interrogate them, was welcome at every table. Ward McAllister, the social arbiter who had defined the 400 and organised the great balls and dinners of the era, was himself considered an accomplished dinner guest, though his memoirs suggest that he could occasionally be insufferable. The women of the Gilded Age were often the most accomplished conversationalists at the table. Theresa Fair Ulrichs, who built Rosecliff and was famous for the lavishness of her entertainments, was also known as a sparkling talker, quick and funny and generous in her attention. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, another of the grand dames of the Newport summer, was famous for her witticisms, which could be sharp enough to draw blood but which were delivered with such good humour that the victim was often not quite certain they had been wounded. As the evening wore on and the courses multiplied, the quality of the conversation at a Gilded Age dinner often improved. The wine loosened the formal constraint of early dinner, the accumulation of shared experience, the food, the wine, the room, the occasion, created a particular atmosphere of warmth and ease that the servants, moving quietly behind the chairs, could not share but could observe. At a certain point, after the desserts had been removed or sometimes before, the women rose together and withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the men at the table with their port and their cigars. This was a practice inherited from English upper-class life and maintained in American society long after it had begun to seem anachronistic. The drawing-room separation lasted perhaps half an hour, during which the women talked among themselves and the men drank and smoked and, freed from the conventions of mixed company, sometimes spoke more directly about the subjects, business, politics, that had been avoided during dinner. Then the men joined the women in the drawing-room and the evening began its second half. There might be music, a professional singer engaged for the evening, or an accomplished amateur among the guests playing the piano. There might be cards, not gambling, or not exactly, though small stakes were sometimes involved. There was always more talk, now looser and more various, small groups forming and dissolving, conversation shifting. And at some point, 11 o'clock perhaps, or midnight, or later, depending on the energy of the occasion, the guests began to leave. Carriages were called, farewells were made, and the house, slowly, returned to itself. The servants cleared the dining room, which had been sitting in the aftermath of the dinner, the candles burned down, the table marked with rings from the wine glasses, the flowers slightly wilted in the warmth, and restored it to something approaching its daytime order. The kitchen staff washed the last of the china and the crystal. The butler checked the doors. And upstairs, in the bedchambers where the velvet curtains were already drawn against the night, the guests and the family prepared for sleep. The house settled. Outside, the stars were out over the Atlantic. The sea was the same as it had always been, dark and vast and patient. Not every evening in Newport ended quietly. Some evenings, the great evenings, the ones that were planned months in advance and talked about for years afterward, did not end until the sky above the ocean had begun to lighten. The Gilded Age ball was a phenomenon that requires some effort of imagination to properly appreciate, because nothing quite like it exists in the contemporary world. The great balls of Newport in the late 19th century were events of such scale and expense and deliberate spectacle that they constituted a form of public statement, a declaration by the host of their wealth, their taste, and their position in the social order. The most famous ball of the Gilded Age, perhaps the most famous ball in American history, was the one given by Alva Vanderbilt in her New York mansion in March of 1883. The ostensible occasion was the housewarming of the new Vanderbilt house at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street, which Hunt had designed in the style of a French Renaissance chateau. The real occasion was the formal debut of the Vanderbilts into the inner circle of New York society, from which they had previously been excluded by the judgment of Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, who controlled access to that circle with the authority of an empress. Alva's stratagem was brilliant. She sent invitations to everyone of social importance, and did not send one to Mrs. Astor. When it became clear that Mrs. Astor would not receive an invitation unless she first paid a call on Alva Vanderbilt, thereby acknowledging the Vanderbilt's social legitimacy, the old queen of society faced a choice: maintain her position and miss the most talked-about party of the decade, or capitulate and be admitted. She capitulated. She called on Alva. The invitation was extended, and the Vanderbilts entered New York society. The ball itself was a costume ball, a masquerade, at which the guests appeared in costumes of extraordinary elaboration. Alva herself came as a Venetian princess. Her guests came as Mary Queen of Scots, as Louis XIV, as various medieval figures, as classical goddesses, as characters from literature. The costumes had been made in Paris and London and represented months of preparation and thousands of dollars in expense. The house was decorated with palms and orchids and garlands of flowers so numerous that the smell in the closed ballroom was almost overwhelming. The Newport summer balls were smaller than this. The setting was more intimate, the guest list limited by the size of even the grandest Newport ballroom. But the same principles applied: enormous care, great expense, deliberate spectacle, the intention of being remembered. Theresa Fair Ulrichs gave a ball at Rosecliff in August of 1904 that became the stuff of legend. She had the ballroom, already the largest in Newport, decorated to represent the sea itself, with enormous shells and sea creatures of spun glass and painted papier-mâché, and the guests who arrived found themselves apparently at the bottom of the ocean, surrounded by the blue light that had been rigged to suggest depth, and the walls covered with sea vegetation, and the figures of Neptune and his attendants. The effect was theatrical to the point of surrealism. It was also, by every account, absolutely magnificent. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish gave parties with a deliberately ironic edge. She understood that the great entertainments of her world were theatre, and she was willing to admit it. At one of her dinners, the guest of honour was reportedly a monkey dressed in evening clothes. At another, she invited her neighbours to meet Prince del Drago, an exotic foreign aristocrat, who turned out to be a gentleman in costume. The joke was on the pretensions of the world she inhabited, even as she inhabited it with complete commitment. But these were the great occasions. The ball that we are imagining tonight is a quieter one, a private dance, as they were sometimes called, in one of the houses that had a ballroom but was not among the very grandest. A dance for 50 or 60 guests, hosted by a family that was wealthy but not in the first rank of Newport wealth. The kind of evening that was simply pleasant: music, dancing, the company of friends and acquaintances, the pleasure of the house in its evening dress. The ballroom, which had been cleared of its ordinary furniture and its floor waxed to a high polish, was lit by the chandelier and by additional candelabra placed along the walls. The orchestra, 4 or 5 pieces perhaps, violin, cello, piano, sometimes a flute, was positioned at one end behind a screen of potted ferns. The music had begun with a waltz, the dominant dance of the era, and then moved through a sequence of quadrilles and polkas, and later in the evening the lancers and the cotillion. The waltz. Of all the dances of the Gilded Age, the waltz is the one that carries the strongest charge of memory, because it is a dance that involves genuine physical contact: the man's hand on the woman's waist, the held hands, the revolving movement, and because it is a dance in which the partners must synchronize their bodies with a completeness that requires trust. To waltz well in a ballroom of the Gilded Age, with an orchestra playing Strauss or Waldteufel and 40 or 50 other couples revolving around you on a polished floor, with the candles and the chandelier providing a light that was flattering and warm, with the music lifting and falling and the rhythm entering your body through the soles of your feet. This was one of the genuine physical pleasures of the era. The constraints of the rest of the social world, the formal dinners, the calling cards, the elaborate negotiations of status, dissolved, at least briefly, into something more immediate and more physical. the young people danced most. The older guests sat along the walls in gilt chairs, watching and talking and occasionally being asked to dance by someone who was being kind or who genuinely wanted their company. The married couples danced together at the beginning and end of the evening. The unmarried danced with a variety of partners, which was the point. The ball was a marriage market, subtly but unmistakably, and the dance was the medium in which acquaintances could become something more. By midnight, the formal dances had given way to something slightly more informal. The supper, which at a private dance was served at a long buffet table in the dining room or the adjoining gallery, rather than at a seated dinner, had been eaten, a light supper of cold dishes, ices, champagne. The dancing had resumed, but more loosely now, and some guests had settled into the corners and the window embrasures for conversation that was less constrained than the dinner table had allowed. The candles in the chandelier were burning lower. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the sky above the ocean was dark and full of stars. The music went on. The couples turned. The house held all of this, the music and the dancing and the conversation and the candlelight and the stars through the window, held it all without judgment, without rush. The night was long. The music was slow. And the world, for a few more hours, was exactly as it had always been. Sunday in the Gilded Age was different from Saturday. Saturday was performance and activity, and the great social machinery in motion. Sunday was, by comparison, quiet, or at least quieter. The social calendar lightened. The formal obligations were fewer. The day had a different texture, slower, more domestic, more reflective. The wealthy families of Newport went to church on Sunday mornings. This was not, in all cases, an expression of deep religious conviction, though in some cases it was. It was also a social obligation, a mark of respectability, a tradition that had been maintained through enough generations to be observed automatically. The great episcopal churches of Newport, Trinity Church on Queen Anne Square, St Mary's on Spring Street, were filled on Sunday mornings with the summer colony in its Sunday morning clothes, less formal than evening dress, more careful than weekday tweeds. Trinity Church was particularly associated with the old Newport families and the summer colony. It was a beautiful church, built in the early 18th century, its white interior cool and serene, its box pews the remnant of an older ecclesiastical arrangement in which families rented their own pews as they might rent a box at the opera. The Vanderbilts and the Astors and the other great families had their designated pews, and they occupied them with the consistency of habit. The service, Anglican, moderate, musically competent, lasted approximately an hour. The sermon, delivered by a clergyman who was careful not to say anything that might disturb the comfortable pieties of his very wealthy congregation, was typically on a text from the New Testament, interpreted in a way that confirmed the virtues of charity and hard work and family without troubling the financial arrangements that made the life of the summer colony possible. After the service, on the steps of the church and on the pavement of Queen Anne Square, the Sunday morning social gathering occurred. This was brief but important. The exchange of greetings, the arrangement of informal Sunday luncheon invitations, the news of the week's social calendar ahead. Then the carriages collected their passengers, and the great houses absorbed their inhabitants again. Sunday luncheon was quieter than the weekday meals. Fewer guests more often than not, or no guests at all, just the family itself, in a smaller dining room or on the veranda if the weather was fine. The food was simpler, a cold joint perhaps, left from the previous day's dinner, or a roast chicken or a fish pie, a trifle or a fruit tart for dessert. The wine was lighter or absent. After luncheon, Sunday afternoon opened up with a quality of time that was almost physical, long, unstructured, warm if the season was right. The formal obligations were suspended. The social machinery was at rest. Some people slept. A nap after Sunday luncheon was entirely acceptable, even among the most energetic of the Newport summer colony. And there was a quality of afternoon light in the great bedchambers. The curtains drawn against the sun, the room cool, the sound of the sea or the garden coming in through the partly open windows, that made sleep not just permissible but genuinely desirable. Others read. Sunday afternoon in a Gilded Age house was one of the reliable reading times of the week, and the libraries of these houses were not merely decorative. The books were real and were read. Henry James, who moved between the worlds of the Anglo-American wealthy with the attentiveness of a naturalist studying a new species, was red. Edith Wharton, who was herself a product of this world, and whose novels anatomized it with surgical precision, was red, though sometimes with the discomfort of recognition. History was red, biography, the new novels from England, the collected poems of the Romantics. A Sunday afternoon in the library, the windows open to the garden, a good novel in hand, the household quiet around you, the smell of books and faint roses coming through the window. This was one of the genuine pleasures of the era, available to the very rich and the very poor alike, though the room in which it took place differed considerably. Some families took Sunday afternoon drives, not the social parade of the weekday, but a quieter excursion, sometimes into the interior of the island, where the farmland stretched out in a landscape that was almost pastoral, the great houses invisible, the world simple and green. Or along the coast, where the rocky shores of Newport presented a different face from the smooth lawns and manicured gardens of Bellevue Avenue. The children were more present on Sundays. Without the formal adult entertainments that structured the rest of the week, Sunday afternoons often found parents and children together in the garden, or on the beach if the house had access to one, or simply in the informal sitting room where games might be played and conversations conducted across the generational divide in a way that the formal week did not allow. These were, by the accounts of those who lived them, among the happiest hours of the Newport summer. The great houses, which spent most of the week as theatres of social performance, became for a few hours on Sunday afternoon simply homes, places where a family ate and talked and read and sat in comfortable chairs and watched the light change on the water. There is something moving about this when you consider it. These families, who had built such extraordinary monuments to their wealth and their ambitions, found their simplest pleasures in precisely the things that were not monuments: a quiet afternoon, a good book, a garden in the Sunday light, the sound of children in the distance. The world always returns to its simplest forms in the end. The light on the water, the smell of a garden, the sound of a child's voice. These are the things that endure. As the afternoon turned toward evening, the Newport Sunday began to stir again. Sunday evening entertainments were smaller and less formal than the great Saturday productions. A dinner for 8 or 10, a quiet musical evening, sometimes simply a gathering of 2 or 3 families who were close enough to enjoy each other's company without the machinery of formal entertaining. And then Sunday evening settled into Sunday night. The stars came out again over the Atlantic. The lighthouse on Castle Hill sent its beam across the dark water. The great houses grew quiet one by one as their inhabitants retired. In the morning, the week would begin again. Monday would bring the morning calls, the afternoon activities, the evening engagements. The social machinery would crank itself back into motion. But not yet. For now, the night. The quiet, enormous night. The sea. The stars. The ancient, unhurried turning of the world. Let yourself drift. The bed is soft. The air is cool. The sound of the sea is constant. To understand the Gilded Age weekend truly, you must at some point turn your attention to the people who made it possible. The servants, the vast, invisible army of workers who sustained the lives of the very wealthy with their labour and their skill and their discretion. In the great houses of Newport, the staff was organised on a scale and with a complexity that resembled, in some respects, the administration of a small institution. The butler stood at the top of the below-stairs hierarchy, responsible for the dining room and the wine cellar and the household silver and the behaviour of the male indoor staff. The housekeeper was his equivalent authority on the female side, supervising the housemaids and the laundress and the kitchen staff. Below them came a carefully graduated hierarchy. The footmen in their livery, the housemaids with their caps and aprons, the parlour maids, the kitchen maids, the scullery maids, the cooks, the ladies' maids and valets, the nurses and nursery maids for the children. Outside, the hierarchy was different but equally precise. The head coachman, the under-coachman, the grooms and stable boys, the head gardener, the under-gardeners, the groundskeepers. In the largest houses there were also tradespeople who attended regularly, the butcher, the fishmonger, the greengrocer, all of whom made daily deliveries and were received always at the back entrance. The number of staff in a great Newport house during the summer season might reach 40 or 50 individuals, and in the largest establishments considerably more. The breakers during the height of the season was maintained by a staff that some accounts put at over 40, not counting the coachmen and stable staff. Marble House, though somewhat smaller, required comparable numbers. These were not people who worked short hours. The day of a housemaid in a Gilded Age household began before 6 in the morning, when she rose and dressed in her morning uniform and began the cleaning of the ground floor rooms before the family was awake. She might not be fully free of her duties until 9 or 10 in the evening, when the last guest had been seen to their room and the last service of the day had been completed. Her day off, she was entitled to 1 half-day per week and 1 full Sunday per month, was a genuine luxury, not a right. The conditions of service in these great houses varied considerably, depending on the character of the household. Some families were known as good employers, fair, consistent in their expectations, willing to accommodate the personal needs of their staff within reasonable limits. Other households were demanding, critical, given to sudden dismissal over minor infractions. The world of the servants was in some respects a complete parallel universe to the world of the family. The servants had their own dining room, the servants' hall, where they ate their meals according to their own hierarchy, the upper servants at one end, the lower at the other. They had their own social relationships, their own gossip, their own small dramas of courtship and friendship and rivalry. The footmen and housemaids who moved through the great rooms of the Vanderbilt or Ulrichs households during the working day retreated in their off hours to a domestic world that was cramped and simple and warm, with a shared intimacy of people living and working in close proximity. The knowledge that servants carried was intimate. They knew which family members rose earliest, which slept latest. They knew who argued and who reconciled. They knew the state of the household finances, at least by inference. A household that was beginning to struggle financially showed it first in the quality of the provisions, in the size of the staff, in small economies that an observant servant noticed immediately. They knew the private habits and the private fears of the people they served, because service requires a constant attention to the needs and moods of others that makes servants, paradoxically, among the most closely observed humans in any social world. The great families depended on this knowledge. They depended on the discretion with which it was held, and they depended, in a way that they rarely articulated, on the skill and effort with which the servants made the great houses run. On a Saturday morning, while the family breakfasted in the morning room and the guests slept late in the guest chambers, the servants had already been at work for 3 hours or more. The grates had been cleaned and relaid. The floors of the ground floor rooms had been swept and polished. The silver had been cleaned, a daily task in the grandest houses, where the quantities of silver in use required the constant labour of at least one footman whose primary responsibility was its care. The kitchen was in full production, the breakfast things still being cleared away, the preparations for lunch already underway, the afternoon's requirements being considered. This work was invisible by design. The great houses were built to conceal their own operations. The service staircases, the back corridors, the hidden doors that opened from the servants' quarters directly into the rooms they served. All of these were architectural strategies to maintain the illusion that the house operated by itself, that the meals appeared and the fires were already burning and the flowers were always fresh through some elegant, unexplained magic. And yet the magic required people. It always requires people. In the kitchens, which in the great houses were large, high-ceilinged rooms equipped with the best available technology of the era, the cook, who was called the chef in households that employed a professional male kitchen staff, and the cook in those that employed a woman, was the presiding intelligence of the below-stairs world. The cook of a great Gilded Age house was a professional of considerable skill, trained in the French culinary tradition that dominated high-class cooking in America as in Europe, responsible for producing meals of great technical complexity and variety under the constant pressure of the social calendar above. The skill required was real and demanding. The French classical tradition, Escoffier's Grande Cuisine, involved hundreds of basic preparations, stocks and sauces, pastry doughs and mousses, the classic garnishes and accompaniments that transformed a piece of good meat or fish into something of the proper social weight. A cook who could produce a consommé of perfect clarity, a hollandaise that did not break, a soufflé that rose at precisely the right moment and held long enough to be served, was worth considerable money and was sought by the great households. And yet the cook, for all her or his skill and importance, remained invisible at the table. The food appeared, was consumed, was praised, or not mentioned, because in polite society one did not discuss the cooking unless to offer a very brief compliment to the hostess. The cook's labour was woven into the fabric of the evening and then disappeared as the evening ended. This is one of the profound strangeness of the Gilded Age, seen from a later vantage. The degree to which the wealth and leisure of the few depended on the labour and skill of the many, and the degree to which this dependency was systematically denied. The servants were essential, they were also invisible. The two conditions coexisted without apparent contradiction in the minds of those who benefited. But the servants themselves did not find it contradictory. They knew what they were worth, they negotiated for wages and conditions, they left service when better positions were available. They formed their own communities and maintained their own dignity within the constraints of their world. The life of a skilled servant in a great Gilded Age house was hard and limited in ways that are not to be romanticized. But it was also, for those who mastered its demands, a life of professional accomplishment and modest security in a world where neither was to be taken for granted. As the house settles towards sleep tonight, it is worth holding this awareness gently, the awareness of all the invisible hands that made the visible world possible. The ones who came before the others woke and stayed after the others slept. The ones whose names have mostly not survived in the histories of these great houses, but whose work shaped every hour that has been described in this account. They were here too. They were part of this world. And in the quiet of the house at night, when the family has retired and the fires have been banked and the last task has been completed, the kitchen is finally still, and the servants have found their own beds in their own small rooms, and the house breathes evenly in the darkness. Everyone finally is asleep. Newport was not only its houses, it was its landscape too, the particular quality of its coastline, the way the island sat in the bay, the Atlantic to the south and east, the gentler waters of the bay to the north and west, and around it all the remarkable combination of human cultivation and natural wildness that made Newport not just a place to be rich in, but a genuinely beautiful place. The cliff walk was the great democratic feature of Gilded Age Newport. It ran for 3 miles along the eastern edge of the island, above the rocky shores of the Atlantic, between the back gardens of the great Bellevue Avenue estates and the sea below. It was a public path. It remained public by legal right even as the estates of the wealthy were built on either side of it, and on a summer weekend it was populated by everyone. The summer colony walking for pleasure in their informal clothes, local residents, visitors from Providence and Boston and New York, young people courting, children running ahead of nurses, the occasional artist with a sketch pad. The cliff walk was a place where the social distances of the Newport world were momentarily suspended. On Bellevue Avenue, the great carriages defined a social space that was self-consciously exclusive. On the cliff walk, everyone walked the same path above the same sea. The path itself varied in character along its length. The northern section, closest to the hotels and the commercial parts of town, was smooth and well-maintained, a comfortable promenade above the rocks. As it extended south, past the great estates, Château-sur-Mer, Rough Point, Ochre Point, the breakers itself, the back of the breaker's lawn visible through the iron fence, the path became more dramatic. The cliffs rose higher, and the sea below was more powerful, the waves breaking against the rocks with a sound that rose and fell with the wind. At certain points the path crossed the rocky ledges directly, requiring some care and a certain confidence on the part of the walker. These crossings were not difficult for the healthy, but they were perhaps not entirely appropriate for the very old or the very young, and they gave the cliff walk a quality of mild adventure that distinguished it from the more manicured pleasures of the season. The smell of the cliff walk in summer, salt air and the particular mineral smell of wet rock, and the smell of the sea vegetation in the rock pools, and sometimes, if you were close enough to the back of one of the estates, the smell of cut grass and flowers from the gardens. The sound, the sea, always the sea, but differentiated by the action of wind and wave against the specific topography of the coast. In some places the waves struck the rocks directly and broke with a sharp concussion. In others they moved into sea caves and crevices and created a rhythmic sighing, a sound like very slow breathing. On a calm day the surface of the water below the cliffs was a deep blue-green, clear enough to see the rocks below the surface. On a rough day it was white with foam and the sound was continuous and deep. Many of the Newport families walked the cliff walk on their Saturday and Sunday mornings. It was informal exercise of a kind that suited the relaxed morning mood, enough activity to be healthy, not so much as to be demanding. The Vanderbilts walked it, Cornelius and his wife Alice, in the early morning before the social machinery of the day had started. Henry James, who was a frequent visitor to Newport, walked it and wrote about it with the attention of a man for whom landscape and social character were aspects of the same phenomenon. The Ocean Drive, which was built in the 1870s and extended around the southern tip of the island, was the carriage route par excellence for those who wanted something grander than Bellevue Avenue's social parade. The Ocean Drive ran along the rocky southern coast of the island, past Brenton Point, past the rugged outcroppings where the Atlantic was unmediated by any barrier, past the lighthouse at the point, and along the quieter western shore of the island. A drive along the Ocean Drive on a Saturday afternoon in August was a genuine aesthetic experience. The coastline was wild in a way that Bellevue Avenue was not, the rocks worn by the sea into shapes of considerable drama, the vegetation sparse and wind-bent, the horizon a clean line where the blue of the sea met the paler blue of the sky. The carriages moving along this road passed through a landscape that was, for all the wealth of the drivers, indifferent to them. The sea did not care who drove beside it. The rocks were older than any fortune. This combination of the cultivated and the wild was one of the things that distinguished Newport from the more entirely artificial pleasure grounds of the era. It was a real place as well as a social one, real weather, real tides, real geological formations that the Vanderbilts and the Astors did not own and could not improve. The experience of moving through this landscape, on horseback in a carriage, on foot along the cliff, had a quieting effect that the social world of Newport needed. All that expense, all that performance, all that elaborate negotiation of status and wealth, and then the sea, unchanged, enormous, uncaring. It put things in perspective. Not always, not for everyone, but sometimes. The sea does that. Let it do that now. Imagine the edge of the cliff, the rocks below, the water moving over them, the horizon perfectly straight, perfectly indifferent, the wind on your face, the smell of salt. The world for a moment is very simple. Breathe. Newport in the Gilded Age was not only its cottagers, the wealthy families who owned the great houses and ran the summer colony. It was also a working town, with a working-class population that had been there long before the wealthy arrived, and that served them with something between pride and exasperation. The local residents of Newport, the year-round population that lived through the mild but sometimes punishing winters as well as the theatrical summers, were a complex community. There were the old Newport families, many of them of English or Portuguese descent, who had lived on the island for generations and who remembered when it was a trading port rather than a pleasure resort. There were Irish immigrants and their descendants, who had come during and after the famine years and had built lives in Newport's working-class neighbourhoods. There were African Americans, a community of some antiquity in Newport, where free black residents had lived since the colonial era. These residents worked in the hotels and the shops and the restaurants that catered to the summer colony. They worked in the tradespeople's establishments, the butchers and bakers and fishmongers and grocers and florists, whose daily deliveries kept the great houses supplied. They worked as domestic servants, some of them, and as construction workers who built and maintained the estates. They were part of the Newport that made the Newport of the summer colony possible. On a Saturday afternoon in season, the commercial streets of Newport, Thames Street, Spring Street, Bellevue Avenue's shops, were busy with the subsidiary traffic of the wealthy, the household staff sent on errands, the guests walking to look at the shop windows, the young ladies purchasing gloves or ribbon, or a new piece of music for the evening's entertainment. The shops of Gilded Age Newport were themselves interesting establishments. The jewellers on Bellevue Avenue dealt in pieces of genuine quality, not the great museum pieces that the Vanderbilts and Astors kept in their safes, but good jewellery for the upper-middle-class summer visitor, pearls and garnets and fine gold, appropriate for an afternoon shopping as well as a serious purchase. The bookseller carried current novels and the fashionable magazines. The milliner's window showed hats of considerable ingenuity, constructed of straw and silk and feathers and ribbons in arrangements that were the product of real craft. The casino's shops, because the Newport Casino had shops as well as athletic facilities, were particularly fashionable. Sportswear of various kinds was available. Tennis clothes, yachting clothes, golf clothes. Golf was beginning to make its presence felt as a fashionable sport toward the end of the century. Equipment was available, rackets, yachting accessories, the paraphernalia of the active Gilded Age leisure. The relationship between the summer colony and the local Newport population was genuinely complex. The wealthy brought enormous amounts of money into the local economy. The servants, the tradespeople, the hotel workers, everyone who served the summer colony was financially dependent on it, and the summer months, with their concentrated expenditure, sustained families through the long, quiet winters. There was therefore a practical gratitude, or at least a practical acceptance, of the wealthy and their habits. But there was also a kind of irony in the local consciousness. The people of Newport had watched over 30 or 40 years as their town was transformed from a working port and a quiet resort into this extraordinary theatre of wealth. They had seen the farmland and the marshland and the simple seaside houses replaced by marble palaces. They had absorbed the summer colony into their economic life, and had been absorbed in turn into its service economy. And they had maintained, beneath the surface of accommodation, the independent perspective of people who would be there after the carriages had gone, and the houses had been shuttered, and the ocean had returned to its winter self. The servants, too, held their own perspective. The lady's maid who helped dress Mrs. Vanderbilt for the evening ball knew exactly what the dress cost, and exactly what her own wages were. The footman who poured the wine at the great dinner table had his own opinions about the guests who drank it. The cook who produced the 10-course feast had a cook's respect for the work and a worker's awareness of what the work was worth. These perspectives were rarely expressed in the historical record, because the people who held them were not the people whose letters and diaries and memoirs were preserved. But they existed. They informed the daily life of the great houses in ways that are not always visible in the accounts of the wealthy themselves. The Newport of the Gilded Age was a world made by many people for the benefit of a very few. The few knew it to varying degrees and managed the knowledge in various ways, through philanthropy, through paternalism, through studied inattention. The many knew it with the clarity that physical labour tends to produce. All of them shared the same island, the same summer, the same sky. The sea was the same for everyone. The stars at night made no distinctions. Let this thought rest gently, not as a reproach, but as a reminder that every world is larger than it appears from any single vantage point. The great house seen from the garden gate tells one story. The kitchen, with its warmth and its labour and its smells, tells another. Both are true. Both are part of the world we are moving through tonight. The night is very quiet now. The sounds of the day have faded. Only the sea remains, and the wind, and somewhere far away, the cry of a bird moving over the water in the darkness. Not everyone who came to Newport in summer was entirely absorbed in the social rituals of the cottager world. Newport had been a refuge for artists and writers long before the Vanderbilts arrived, and the artistic tradition of the place survived, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully, alongside the social one. The painters had come earliest. The Hudson River School artists, who were the dominant school of American landscape painting in the mid-19th century, had been drawn to Newport by its coastline, the dramatic rock formations and the quality of light over the water, the sense of the Atlantic as a vast, sublime presence. John Kensett painted Newport's shores repeatedly, finding in the relationship between rock and water a stillness that his paintings have maintained for over a century and a half. William Morris Hunt, whose brother Richard Morris Hunt would later become the great architect of Gilded Age Newport, was himself a painter trained in France, who had settled in Newport and who taught some of the most important artists of the next generation. Henry James came to Newport as a young man and spent several formative years there, and the experience marked him permanently. Newport was the setting for his early attempts at fiction, the place where he first tried to understand the peculiar texture of American upper-class life that would become his great subject. He was aware, from early in his Newport years, of the complexity of the world he was observing, the enormous wealth and the elaborate social rituals and the American hunger for European culture and European legitimacy, which he would later explore in novel after novel with an ironic tenderness that has never been surpassed. Edith Wharton, who was a Gilded Age creature herself, born into the old New York money, trained in its rituals, ultimately in rebellion against its constraints, wrote about this world with the precision of an insider and the perspective of someone who had thought long and hard about what it meant. Her novels, The House of Mirth, The Age of Innocence, The Custom of the Country, are the finest literary record of the Gilded Age social world, and they remain readable not as historical documents, but as explorations of human character, of the way that social systems shape and constrain, and sometimes destroy the people who inhabit them. Warton herself spent summers at Newport and later at the Mount. Her house in the Berkshires and the houses she lived in and visited fed her imagination in ways that are visible on every page of her fiction. The drawing rooms, the dinner tables, the subtle gradations of social rank, all of these are present in her work with the specificity of things that have been observed, not invented. On a Saturday afternoon in Newport, if you were curious and affluent and not entirely absorbed in the social performance, you might find yourself in conversation with someone like this: an artist working in a medium that was not primarily social, a painter sketching on the rocks below the cliff walk, squinting at the light on the water, a writer in a wicker chair on the veranda of the Redwood Library, making notes in a small book, a musician preparing for the evening's private concert with a seriousness that was in some contrast to the casualness of the setting. The Redwood Library, which had been founded in 1747 and was one of the oldest libraries in America, was a place where the intellectual side of Newport found its expression. Its reading rooms were cool and quiet, and its collection, while not the grandest in New England, was serious and wide-ranging. The summer residents who used it were a different sort from those who spent their afternoons in the casino, quieter, more internally directed, more interested in books than in being seen. Music was serious in the great houses, not merely decorative. The musicales that were held in private drawing rooms were sometimes events of genuine artistic weight, professional musicians of European training performing for small audiences of genuine listeners. The Gilded Age wealthy were, many of them, musically educated in a way that their descendants might not be. Piano lessons were de rigueur for girls of good family, and the ability to play acceptably was a social accomplishment expected of every woman of the class. Some played very well indeed. The collections of art that filled the great houses were also in some cases extraordinary. The Vanderbilts collected paintings, not always with the surest eye, but with tremendous ambition, and the resources to pursue it. J.P. Morgan was perhaps the greatest collector of his era, assembling over his lifetime a collection of manuscripts, paintings, bronzes, ceramics, jewellery, and books that is now distributed among several great museums. His approach to collecting was that of a man who wanted not just to own things, but to understand them, and his collecting reflected a genuine if aristocratic aesthetic intelligence. Isabella Stewart Gardner, who was a Boston heiress rather than a Newport cottager but who moved in the same social world, built a museum in Boston to house her collection, Fenway Court, which opened in 1903 and is now the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. She had assembled over decades, with the assistance of the art historian Bernard Berenson, a collection that included Titian, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Raphael, and Botticelli, among others. The museum is arranged in the style of a Venetian palazzo, the rooms furnished as Gardner furnished them, the light coming through the central courtyard in a way that is both theatrical and intimate. To stand in a room of the Gardner Museum, or to imagine it, which is perhaps what we are doing tonight, drifting through these Gilded Age interiors as they existed in their prime, is to understand something about the hunger for culture that coexisted with all the competitive wealth. The great paintings and the great objects that the Gilded Age collected were not just status symbols. They were also, for those who cared to look at them properly, gateways to other worlds, other times, other modes of human feeling. They were evidence of the persistence of beauty, of the fact that something made by a human hand in Florence in 1485 could still move a person standing before it in Newport or Boston or New York in 1895. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, one of the most important things there is. The painting on the wall of the drawing room, the late afternoon light falling through the tall windows across the canvas, and the painted light responding, the two lights, the natural and the painted, in a conversation that has been going on since the painting was made. The book on the library table, slightly open, at the page where someone stopped reading and put it down, meaning to return to it. The music in the evening drawing room, a pianist playing something slow and romantic, a nocturne perhaps, the notes falling into the listening silence and dissolving there. These things persist. They persist even after the houses are closed and the season is over, and the carriages have gone and the servants have returned to their winter lives and the great halls are empty. The beauty persists. Let it carry you now into the last part of the evening. The night is deepening. The house is very quiet. The Gilded Age did not end with a single event. It faded, slowly and then quickly, under the pressure of historical forces that no amount of money could resist. The income tax, introduced by the 16th Amendment in 1913, changed the arithmetic of great wealth forever. The First World War, which began in 1914 and ended in 1918, destroyed the European social world that the American wealthy had modelled themselves on and created a new sensibility, harder, more ironic, less given to the grand gesture, that had no use for marble chateaux and 10-course dinners. The stock market crash of 1929 and the depression that followed reduced several of the great fortunes to shadows of themselves. The Second World War completed the transformation. The great houses were casualties of this change. Some were demolished, their marble and their mahogany and their wrought iron sold or given away or simply lost. Others were converted to schools, hotels, convents, institutions. A few were preserved by the generosity of the families who owned them or by the intervention of historical organizations, and they survive as museums, open to anyone who wants to walk through them and imagine the life they once contained. The Breakers is now owned by the Preservation Society of Newport County and is open to visitors. Marble House is open to visitors. Rosecliff is open to visitors. On summer weekends, thousands of people walk through the rooms that the Vanderbilts and the Belmonts and the Elricks once inhabited, and they look at the marble and the gilt and the parquet floors and the enormous chandeliers, and they think, what? Something about the persistence of beauty, perhaps. Something about the distance between that world and this one. Something about what it means to live with ambition and wealth, and all the anxiety of status, and what it means to let it go. The servants who worked in these houses left almost no written record. Their names are lost in most cases, their personalities unknown, their stories untraceable. This is one of the great silences of historical record, the silence of those who served. The families themselves are more traceable. The Vanderbilts, who were, at their peak, the richest family in America and among the richest in the world, scattered their fortune across several generations until the famous gathering of his family organised by Arthur Vanderbilt II in the 1970s found that no member of the family was a millionaire. The fortune had been divided and subdivided, spent on education and philanthropy and living, until it was gone. The houses remained as monuments to the original accumulation, while the money that built them had returned to the general circulation of the world. The Astors maintained their position longer. J.P. Morgan's fortune survived the Depression and was channeled into the great institutions, the Metropolitan Museum, the Pierpont Morgan Library, that he had endowed during his lifetime. Some of the old families simply continued quietly, less visible than they had once been, but not absent. And the world they had built, the world of the Saturday morning carriage parade and the Saturday evening ball, and the Sunday morning church and the great steamer yachts, and the 10-course dinners and the housemaids with their dustcloths, and the butlers with their gravity, that world was gone. It was not mourned, at least not widely. The world that replaced it was louder, faster, more democratic in its pleasures, if not always in its opportunities. The automobile replaced the horse and carriage. The airplane eventually replaced the ocean liner. The cinema replaced the private musical evening. The restaurant replaced the formal dinner at home. But the houses remain. And on a summer morning, when the light falls on the white marble of the Breakers' facade at the same angle it has fallen since 1895, and the Atlantic is the same colour it was when Cornelius Vanderbilt II looked at it from his library window, and the roses in the formal garden are in bloom, something of the world we have been moving through tonight is still present. Not the world itself, the world is gone. But the trace of it, the shape of it, the possibility of imagining it. This is what history offers, not the thing itself, but the shadow the thing casts still visible in certain lights, if you are patient enough and still enough to look. The shadow of a great house. The shadow of a Saturday morning. The shadow of a life lived in the conviction that beauty and comfort and the company of interesting people were goods worth pursuing with everything you had. The shadow of the sea, beyond all the houses and all the money and all the ambitions, indifferent and eternal and beautiful. Let the shadow hold you now as the night deepens. The house is very quiet. The season is over. The rooms are empty. The light falls through the dusty windows at the same angle it always did. And somewhere very far away the sea goes on. September came to Newport like a gentleman visitor who had outstayed his welcome and knew it. Graciously, with apologies, but without haste. The summer colony began to thin in the last weeks of August. The families with children sent them back to their schools, Miss Porter's, St. Paul's, Groton, Miss Spence's, which opened in September, and required their students to arrive with trunks packed and summer tan still visible on their faces. The families without children remained longer, reluctant to leave the particular quality of September Newport, which was in many ways the most beautiful time of all. The heat of August gone, the crowds diminished, the light lower and more golden and more contemplative, the sea a deeper colour, the roses in their second bloom. The closing of the great houses was a production in itself, requiring as much organisation as the opening had done. The furniture was covered with Holland cloth, the great white dust sheets that transformed the rooms into a landscape of soft, formless shapes, everything hidden, everything preserved. The silverware was wrapped and locked away in its cases. The china was nested in felt-lined boxes and stored in locked cupboards. The paintings were examined for any new damage and covered or left uncovered according to the preference of the owner. The wine cellar was inventoried, and wines that should not be left through a Rhode Island winter were transferred or consumed. The staff began to diminish. Some servants were retained through the winter in a skeleton arrangement, a caretaker couple, perhaps, responsible for keeping the house aired and preventing the damp and the cold from doing the damage that Rhode Island winters could do to even the best-built houses. The others were released, some to positions in the family's New York or Boston establishments, some to find other employment for the winter months. The gardens were prepared for winter, the tender plants lifted and stored in the greenhouse, the beds mulched against frost, the ornamental trees wrapped in burlap where necessary. The kitchen garden, which had been the source of much of the summer's fresh produce, was cleared and turned over. The greenhouses were inspected and their heating systems checked. The horses were transported back to the city stables or to the country stud farms where they would winter. The coaches and carriages were wrapped and stored. The stable staff returned with the horses or found other positions. And the family, on the last September day of the season, made their final drive along Bellevue Avenue, past the houses that were already beginning to show the signs of closure, the shutters going up on one, the awnings coming down on another, and turned toward the station where the special train that would carry them and their trunks and their horses and their staff back to New York was waiting. The departure from Newport at the end of the season was a moment of genuine feeling, even for those who returned year after year. Something was ending. The particular community of the summer, the people who had been seen and talked to every day for 2 months, the restaurants and clubs and events that had structured the days, the quality of the light over the ocean that was unlike any other light, was dissolving, and it would not be reassembled in exactly this form again. There was also something slightly melancholy in the departure that went beyond mere nostalgia. The great houses, as they were closed up and their inhabitants departed, took on a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of a house, simply at rest. They became, in their closure, monuments, beautiful shells. The rooms that had been filled with music and conversation, and the smell of dinner and the warmth of gathered bodies were now empty and cold, and the marble and the mahogany and the gilded plasterwork were present without context, without the human activity that gave them meaning. The sea, of course, did not notice. The sea in September was the same sea as in July, indifferent, beautiful, eternal. The cliffs and the rocks and the cliff walk and the harbour did not mourn the departure of the summer colony. They had been there before and would be there after, and the passage of the carriages along the ocean drive was a minor event in the long history of this particular piece of coast. This is perhaps the most important perspective on the Gilded Age, finally, that the world in which it occurred, the physical world of rock and sea and sky, was vastly older and would be vastly more enduring than anything the human activity on its surface produced. The houses would eventually decay or be demolished, the fortunes would scatter, The social world would transform beyond recognition. The people would die, every one of them, the servants and the masters alike. But the sea would remain. It remained before the Vanderbilts came, and it remains after they are gone, and it will remain after we are gone too, moving against the same rocks with the same unhurried persistence. There is comfort in this, if you're willing to receive it as comfort rather than as diminishment. The world goes on. The light returns each morning. The roses bloom each summer. And somewhere, always, there is a Saturday morning with the smell of coffee and fresh bread and the sound of the sea, and the day is full of possibility, and the house is quiet, and there is absolutely nowhere that anyone needs to be. Let that morning find you now, wherever you are. Let the season close gently. Let the house grow still. The dust sheets are white in the autumn light. The roses have dropped their petals. The sea goes on. And so we come finally to the end of this long Saturday, this long gilded imagined Saturday that has carried us through the marble halls and the stable yards, and the tennis courts and the yacht harbours and the dinner tables and the ballrooms, and the quiet Sunday churches of the most extravagant leisure culture that America has ever produced. The house is very quiet now. The fires have burned down to embers, the candles have been snuffed, the dinner things have been cleared and put away, the last guest has gone upstairs. The butler has made his final circuit of the ground floor rooms, checking the windows and the locks with the quiet precision of a man who's been doing this for 30 years. The night has settled fully over Newport. The lights in the harbour are reflected in the dark water below. The lighthouse at Castle Hill sends its beam across the Atlantic, steady and slow, a heartbeat of light in the darkness. In the bedchambers of the great house behind the velvet curtains, the inhabitants of this world are finding their way to sleep. The anxieties of the season, the social negotiations, the financial pressures, the family tensions, the ambitions unrealised and the ambitions too well realised, are fading. Sleep comes, as it always comes, for the very rich and the very poor alike, without distinction. The house breathes. The embers cool. The sea goes on. Somewhere in the kitchen, the last of the day's warmth lingers, and a cat that has come in from the stable yard settles on the hearthstone and closes its eyes and sleeps. And the stars above the Atlantic are very bright tonight, and very many, and they are the same stars that have hung above this coast since long before any house was built here, and will continue to hang above it long after every house is gone. The children of the Gilded Age wealthy grew up in a world of extraordinary material abundance and extraordinary social complexity, a combination that shaped them in ways that were not always anticipated and not always comfortable. The child in a great Gilded Age house was, from an early age, aware of the difference between the house she lived in and the houses most other people lived in. The marble entrance hall, the painted ceilings, the armies of servants who attended to every need, the horses and the carriages and the yachts, these were the normal facts of her daily life, and their normalcy did not make them invisible. On the contrary, the specificity of great wealth is very visible precisely because it is so specific. You cannot be in a room with a ceiling painted by an Italian master and not notice that the ceiling is different from ordinary ceilings. This visibility was complicated for children who were naturally curious and naturally empathetic. The child who noticed that the housemaid who cleaned her room was working from before 6 in the morning until after 9 at night, and who asked her mother about it might receive various kinds of answers, that it was the girl's chosen occupation and she was well paid for it, that some people worked and some people had the resources to employ others, and this was simply the way things were, that one should be kind and generous to those who served one and not think too much about the rest. These were not entirely false answers, but they were incomplete ones, and some children felt their incompleteness even before they had the vocabulary to articulate what they felt. Edith Wharton felt it, and it is visible in every novel she wrote. Henry James felt it, and it shaped the peculiar attentiveness to human complexity that is his great literary gift. The children who grew up in the Gilded Age and went on to become the reformers and the progressives of the next generation, the generation that built the labour movement and the conservation movement and the settlement house movement, were often people who had grown up in the great houses and been shaped by both the beauty and the unease of that experience. But most of the children of the Gilded Age simply grew up. They played in the gardens and on the beaches and on the stairways of the great houses. They had their lessons with their governesses and their riding lessons with the stable master, and their dancing lessons with the dancing master who came on Wednesday afternoons. They made friends among the children of the other cottage families, and these friendships had the intensity and the specificity of childhood friendships everywhere, regardless of the marble floors or the painted ceilings. The summer was the best time. In summer, the restrictions of the schoolroom were lifted, and the whole island was available. The cliff walk, which was strictly for adults during the morning social hours, was available for children in the late afternoon when the adults had moved on to other activities. The kitchen garden was a place where a child could spend an hour with the kitchen gardener, learning the names of plants and being given a ripe tomato warm from the vine to eat. The stables were a world of their own, full of animals and activity and the specific smell of horse and hay that many of these children would carry in their sensory memory for the rest of their lives. On a Saturday afternoon in August, a group of children from 2 or 3 of the Bellevue Avenue estates might be at the beach, not the fashionable resort beach to the north of the town where the public bathed in the morning, but a more private stretch of rocky shore accessible through the grounds of one of the estates. The children would be in their bathing costumes, which in the 1890s were substantial garments, woolen and full, not the abbreviated things that would come later, and they would be scrambling on the rocks and catching crabs in the tide pools and throwing stones into the water and doing all the things that children do at the sea, regardless of the century or the social class. The sea does not distinguish. The crabs in the tide pools are the same crabs that the children of the fishermen caught in the same tide pools. The waves that knocked the Vanderbilt children off their feet are the same waves that knocked everyone else off their feet. The sea is a great equalizer, and the children in their woolen bathing costumes shouting and laughing at the edge of the Atlantic were, in this moment at least, simply children, alive and curious and unaware, for the space of an afternoon, of the difference between their marble house and the houses down the hill. Let that sound of children at the sea carry you now toward the edge of sleep. The shout of a child who has caught something in the tidal pool. The splash of a wave. The smell of the sea. The afternoon light. The simple, unguarded joy of being alive on a summer day. This joy is not the property of the wealthy. It was never their property, however much of everything else they owned. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood at the edge of the sea and felt the cold water on their feet and the sun on their face and the wind coming off the water. It belongs to you now as you close your eyes. The sea is there. The afternoon is warm. Sleep is coming. The Gilded Age was built on railroads, and the summer colony arrived in Newport and departed from it by train, by the special trains that ran from New York and Boston in June and returned in September, carrying their freight of trunks and horses and servants and family members through the New England countryside to the ferry crossing at Jamestown, and then by boat to Newport itself. The arrival of the summer colony by train was itself a spectacle. The special trains that the great families chartered, sometimes entire trains, sometimes special cars attached to regular services, were fitted with the particular comfort that money could command. The private parlour car, with its plush seating and its observation platform, its dining facilities and its sleeping quarters, making the 6-hour journey from New York to Newport as comfortable as the road allowed. The New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad, which served Newport, ran its special service with a consciousness of the importance of its clientele. The station master at Newport was a figure of local significance during the summer months, responsible for the smooth management of the arrivals and departures of the most important people in American society. The coaches were cleaned and prepared. The arrangements were made. The arrival itself, the great steam engine pulling into the Newport station on a June afternoon, the platform filling with trunks and porters, and the family members who had come to meet the new arrivals, the sound of greetings and the smell of steam and the particular combination of exhaust and salt air that marked the transition from the train's world to Newport's world, was a moment of genuine social significance. The summer had officially begun. And the departure in September had the opposite quality. The summer officially over, the trunks being loaded one more time, the horses led onto the horse vans, the servants gathering on the platform with their own bags, and their own complicated feelings about the return to the city. The train, moving through the New England countryside, The stone walls and the white farmhouses and the red barns and the glimpse of the sea on the right as it approached the coast, was a liminal space, between one world and another, between the freedom of the summer and the demands of the year. On the train, in the private parlour car, the family sat with a quietness that was different from the quietness of the great house. The house had been many rooms. The car was a single room, and its smallness created an intimacy that the house did not have. The father looked out the window at the passing countryside. The mother wrote letters at the small folding desk. The children looked at the landscape with the specific attention of people who are between places, seeing this landscape clearly precisely because they are leaving it. The world through the train window, the fields and the forests and the rivers and the small towns with their steeples and their station platforms, briefly visible and then gone. The ordinary world, ordinary and various and full of ordinary lives being lived in ways that bore little resemblance to the world of the summer colony. The ordinary world went on, as it always did, regardless of the train passing through it. The countryside was beautiful in the autumn light. The train moved through it, and the great houses of Newport fell away behind, and ahead the city waited with its demands. But that was ahead. For now the train moved through the countryside, and the afternoon light came through the windows of the private car, and the family sat in its own particular quiet, carrying with them the summer, the smell of the sea and the roses, the sound of the piano in the evening drawing-room, the feel of the Cliff Walk's rocks under their feet, into the grey world of September. The summer behind them. The year ahead. The train moving. The light on the fields. Let the motion of the train carry you gently. The countryside passing. The light changing. The world very large and full of lives being lived in it. And somewhere in the distance, behind or ahead, or simply existing in the imagination as a place where it is always the right season and the roses are always blooming, the sound of the sea. Always the sea. Always there. Always moving against the same rocks with the same patient, unhurried persistence. Let it be the last sound you hear tonight. The sea. The great Atlantic. Breathing in the dark. Going on. And you, going with it, into sleep, into the long, kind night, into the rest that waits for everyone who is willing to stop and receive it. Rest! The sea is there. The night is long. Everything is as it should be. Sleep. Thank you so much for watching. The world of the Gilded Age is gone now. Its marble and its horses and its 10-course dinners and its great balls. But the sea it sat beside is still there, and the stars are still there, and the night holds us all with the same patient kindness it has always offered. Sleep well. See you in the next story.